On Tarawa, Marines were dying to snipers they couldn't see. Then a wheat farm kid stabbed a helmet onto a bayonet and lifted it like a puppet. The Japanese fired again and again at empty heads, burning ammo 3 times faster, while Marines hunted the flashes. At 6:17 on the morning of November 21st, 1943, Bedio Island on Tarawa Atoll was already a battlefield that felt alive with hidden guns. The Marines of the 2nd Marine Division had been ashore since the previous day, pinned to a strip of sand and shattered coral no wider than a few hundred yards in places, trying to push inland against a defense built for exactly this moment. The island was flat and exposed, but it was laced with concrete pillboxes, reinforced bunkers, trenches, and hundreds of camouflage firing pits. What Marines would later describe as spider holes, so small and well covered that a rifleman could vanish inside them like he'd never existed. The physical setting made every movement dangerous. Palm trees, blasted and burning, weren't just scenery. Japanese riflemen and snipers had climbed into their fronds and tied themselves in place to shoot down into the beachhead. Concrete emplacements faced the lagoon, while others were angled to rake the shoreline from the sides. By the 2nd day of fighting, enemy fire wasn't only coming from straight ahead. Snipers worked from the flanks and rear as well, slipping into wrecked landing craft and debris fields overnight, turning the Marines' own approach routes into kill zones. Inside shallow foxholes scraped into coral and sand, Marines learned a brutal rhythm. A man lifted his head to spot a bunker. A single shot snapped out. Someone dropped without warning. Another tried to sprint to a shell crater. Another crack, and the run ended. The fear wasn't only the volume of fire, it was the invisibility of it. You could hear the rifle report and still have no idea where it came from. On Bedio that morning, death wasn't a line on the horizon. It was a presence in the palms, in the concrete, in the ground itself, firing once, going silent, and forcing every survivor to wonder which shadow would shoot next. By the 2nd day on Bedio, the Marines weren't just facing ordinary rifle fire. They were up against a defense built to make every Japanese rifleman behave like a sniper. Tarawa's garrison had spent months fortifying a tiny island with interconnected trenches, firing pits, palm-top hides, and concrete pillboxes that covered every approach. The Japanese plan was simple and ruthless. Let the Americans come close. Then cut them down from positions that were almost impossible to spot from the beach. Many of these shooters were not random infantry taking lucky shots. The core defenders included elite naval infantry from the Special Naval Landing Forces, regarded by U.S. intelligence as well-trained, disciplined, and tenacious. They had rehearsed fields of fire and knew the ranges to key choke points across the lagoon edge, and the airfield interior. In practice, this meant a Marine could be hit from a palm crown, a slit in reinforced concrete, or a sand-covered spider hole with no clear line of return fire. What made the sniper threat feel ghost-like was the way they shot and vanished. Japanese defenders used camouflage and pre-selected alternate hides, firing from one position and then shifting along trenches or to nearby pits before Marines could bracket them with fire. American doctrine at the time assumed that once a sniper fired, the unit could locate the flash, suppress the point with heavy fire, and advance to clear it. On Tarawa, that logic collapsed because the flash was fleeting. The firing port was tiny, and the shooter was already moving by the time a Boer or Garand answered back. The math turned the battlefield into a grinder. The 2nd Marine Division brought roughly 18,000 assault troops into the operation, but only a small fraction were trained for counter-sniping in 1943, and Marine Scout sniper platoons weren't yet a formal, widespread capability before Tarawa. So a handful of skilled U.S. marksmen were trying to solve a problem created by hundreds of concealed Japanese rifle positions working in a tight defensive web. That imbalance is why Marines described the island as shooting back from everywhere at once. Each time a man stood, ran, or even lifted his head to look over cover, he was gambling against unseen rifles that had the range. The concealment and the preparation to punish him, it wasn't just that Marines were dying. It was that the usual battlefield logic see, suppress, Advance no longer worked on a flat coral strip where the enemy was invisible and already waiting. Long before Tarawa turned into a maze of palm shadows and rifle cracks, Marcus Holland's world was defined by open sky and wheat. Later accounts of the battle describe him as a young Marine from rural Kansas, raised on a family wheat farm near Liberal, where harvest season was not a backdrop, but a test of whether a household could survive another year on the Great Plains in the 1930s. Wheat farming was constant pressure. Weather, prices, and pests could decide everything. For families working land like the Hollands, losing a portion of the crop could mean losing seed money, equipment upkeep, and the ability to plant next season. In that setting, children did not grow up with soft lessons. They grew up being handed real responsibilities early because the farm did not pause for age. When crows came during late summer, they came in numbers large enough to devastate whole sections of ripening wheat in hours. Farmers across Kansas knew that a boy on a field edge rifle could be the difference between profit and ruin. What Holland learned there. Again, as these later retellings emphasize, was not just how to shoot, but how to think about an enemy that watches for movement. A straight, simple approach was to fire at the birds the moment they landed. But crows are cautious and pattern smart. The first shots scatter them, and after that, they keep their distance, landing farther out, returning in waves, and forcing a shooter to waste time and ammunition while the flock eats what it can. The farm lesson, according to Holland's post-war recollections recorded by others, was to reverse the problem. Don't start by trying to kill what you can see. Start by controlling what the enemy thinks it sees. The principle was practical, almost mechanical. Crows commit to a field when they spot movement, and a shape that signals food is unguarded. If you create false movement, a shirt on a post, a scare figure tugged by a string, anything that looks like a person shifting in the rows, you can pull the birds into predictable places. They dive, circle, regroup, and settle into the same nearby trees or fence lines. That pattern gives the shooter a clear advantage. The trick isn't the decoy itself. It's what the decoy forces the birds to do. It makes them reveal where they are going to be next, and it makes them waste the first safe chance they had to feed Dot by the time Holland joined the Marine Corps. This way of thinking was already part of him. It was not a theory from a field manual, or a clever idea formed in comfort. It was a habit learned under consequences where hesitation meant a thinner harvest and a harder winter. On Tarawa, surrounded by men who were dying to shooters they could not locate, that habit would matter more than any formal training he had received. His farm had taught him that sometimes survival comes from refusing to play the enemy's game. Straight, you change the target and you change the outcome. Back on Betio, by the morning of November 21st, 1943, the battlefield had reduced problem-solving to survival. The island was so narrow and flat that commanders had warned it could be, covered almost everywhere by direct rifle and machine gun fire. And the Japanese defenses were engineered to make that warning real. Trenches, pillboxes, and covered firing pits stitched the ground together. Palm crowns and concrete ports gave hidden shooters angles that Marines on open coral could not easily answer. In foxholes and shell craters, men waited for a target they could actually see, but most shots came from places that were never obvious in time. The battle itself was only in its third day, yet casualties were already severe. And the sense among many units was that standard counter-sniper logic spot the flash, suppress, advance, clear was breaking down under Tarawa's conditions. Marcus. Holland was a private first class in the 2nd Marine Division. Young, with only days of combat behind him, and no rank that normally carried tactical weight. What he did have was a mental habit formed somewhere far from coral and bunkers. On his Kansas wheat farm, he had learned to treat crows not as targets you chase, but as an enemy you manipulate. You don't win by shooting first at what is real. You win by presenting what looks real enough to draw fire and reveal a pattern. On Tarawa, he began applying that same principle to the snipers around him. The psychology felt familiar. Predators. Waiting for movement, committing to a silhouette, then striking quickly and slipping away. The difference was only scale and consequence. When a crow committed to false movement, wheat was saved. When a sniper committed to a false target, Marines might live. The idea, however, was risky in more ways than one. Even if the concept made sense to Holland, there was no manual telling a private that he should alter. How a squad fights in the middle of a landing with thousands of lives at stake. There was also the fear of being wrong. A useless trick could waste time, expose a position, and cost more men. Yet Tarawa was already costing men at a pace that made hesitation feel like surrender. Marines were being killed by shooters they could not locate, and by the time return fire arrived, the marksman had shifted to another hide. In that environment, a solution that sounded crude could be more valuable than a doctrine that was failing. Later accounts of Tarawa describe Holland quietly explaining a simple countermeasure to his superiors. Raise a helmet on a stick or a bayonet. As if a Marine were lifting his head, let the sniper take the shot, and use the muzzle flash and direction of fire to mark the position for immediate counterfire. In other words, stop giving the enemy real heads to aim at. Give him bait. The brilliance of the method was not technology. It was speed. It could be built in seconds from gear already in every foxhole, and attack the one weakness even a skilled sniper cannot escape. He must fire to kill, and the moment he fires, he briefly reveals where death is hiding. Historians and veteran retellings place this helmet decoy idea among the improvised field innovations that began spreading through Marine units during the Tarawa fight, precisely because it solved a deadly problem with tools Marines already had on an island where nothing else was working fast enough. A farm lesson that sounded almost ridiculous was about to become a weapon. On the morning of November 21st, 1943, the fight on Berio had reached a point where small unit improvisation was the only thing moving faster than the casualty list. Tarawa's defenses were packed into barely 2 miles of coral and sand, but they were deep, camouflaged, and pre-registered. Japanese riflemen and snipers fired from palm crowns, trench intersections, covered pits, and narrow slits in reinforced pillboxes. Marines trying to advance inland were exposed on open ground, and a single head rise over a berm could draw a lethal shot from a position that disappeared the instant it fired. The standard American response to flash, suppress, push forward. Clear was hard to execute when the flash was brief, the firing port was tiny, and the shooter could shift through trenches to a second hide within moments. Within that chaos, a helmet decoy was tested at ground level, using nothing more than what Marines already carried. Later veteran recollections and post-war retellings describe a young Marine, often named as Private First Class Marcus Holland, proposing that instead of offering real heads to an unseen marksman, the squad should offer bait, these accounts say. A spare M1 helmet was mounted on the tip of a bayonet or a short stick and raised slowly above cover in the same way. A Marine would cautiously look out. Although official battle histories do not single out one inventor, they do record that improvised decoys spread through Marine units during the Tarawa fight as a practical counter to concealed shooters. The first test depended on timing and on understanding the sniper's habit. The decoy had to move like a real target, slow enough to look human, steady enough to be believable, and exposed just long enough to trigger a shot. For several seconds after the helmet appeared above the foxhole rim, nothing broke the air. That pause was the most dangerous part, because it meant the shooter was watching and choosing. Then the rifle report snapped across the line and the round struck steel, where a forehead would have been. The impact was unmistakable, a sharp, metallic ring, and a fresh hole punched through a helmet that had no head inside it. In one instant, the squad learned 2 facts that had been costing them lives. A sniper was active on that axis, and his exact position was no longer a mystery. The flash and direction of the shot narrowed the hide to a specific tree line, trench. Mouth, or firing slit, return fire could now be deliberate instead of desperate. Marines did not need a perfect visual on the shooter. They needed only a small operating zone. Rifles and automatic weapons were driven into the suspected hide immediately. Before the marksman could complete his relocation, on Tarawa's tight terrain, with ranges often well under a few hundred yards, that suppressive burst was frequently enough to kill or pin the sniper where he lay. Accounts of the early decoy use describe confirmed sniper eliminations following. These first draws achieved without exposing additional Marines to the initial shot. Even where the sniper tried to shift, repeated decoy lifts forced him to fire again, revealing the next height in the chain. For the men in that foxhole, the effect was immediate and practical. Bedio had felt like an island that shot from nowhere. The helmet test gave the island a tell. The decoy did not magically erase the sniper threat, but it flipped the exchange. Movement no longer had to mean sacrifice. Movement could be used to force the enemy to waste rounds, expose himself, and die in the middle of a battle designed to grind Marines down with invisible rifles. A simple helmet lifted on a bayonet opened a new door. The problem was still deadly, but it was no longer unbeatable. What started as a small improvisation in one patch of shattered coral quickly turned into a method. The conditions on Tarawa encouraged speed over formality. Bedio was barely 3 miles long, low enough that Marine planners had warned that almost every foot of it could be covered by direct rifle and machine gun fire. And the Japanese had reinforced that advantage with hundreds of pillboxes, trench lines, and covered firing pits. Marines who tried to solve every hidden shooter by textbook means were losing time they did not have, and men they could not replace dot in that environment. Decoys spread because they were simple enough to copy instantly. Squads began working in pairs. One Marine operated the decoy, often a spare helmet on a bayonet, stick, or entrenching tool handle, while the second watched carefully for the telltale muzzle flash or dust kick from the sniper shot. The moment a round snapped out, the observer could call the direction. A nearby rifleman or a BAR gunner could flood that position with fire before the shooter completed his relocation. That pairing mattered, because Japanese defenders were not isolated marksmen. They were woven into a prepared system of hides and alternate positions. Repeated decoy lifts let Marines narrow a sniper's operating zone and then hammer it. The trick forced the enemy to reveal himself on Marine terms, not his own. Tarawa was also a battle where combined small unit tools decided outcomes minute by minute. Once a suspected hide was pinned down by decoy-drawn fire, Marines used whatever could reach it fastest. Browning automatic rifles and Guangarons provided immediate volume. Mortar teams, often operating just behind the front line, dropped rounds into trench mouths or spider holes that rifles couldn't cleanly hit. Engineered demolition and flamethrower teams were brought forward repeatedly to burn out or blast concrete pillboxes and covered pits that kept firing even under small arms suppression. These assault teams were a documented feature of the fight, used to reduce strong points that had survived naval bombardment. The practical effect was a rapid sequence of local victories. In sectors where decoys were used systematically, Marines could move without giving away real bodies, and each exchange became lopsided. A helmet took the first shot, the sniper exposed his slot, and the squad answered with concentrated fire. Mortar bursts, or close assault. Even when a sniper tried to shift, the next decoy rise pressured him into firing again or holding his fire long enough for Marines to advance. Either choice benefited the attackers. The method did not require special gear, extra training cycles, or new orders from division headquarters only. The willingness to treat a spare helmet as bait and a flash of rifle fire as a roadmap, word of any working tactic on Tarawa traveled faster than official radio traffic. Men in neighboring holes watched a decoy draw a shot and saw the hidden rifle fall silent after return fire. They copied it immediately. Some squads raised multiple helmets at once to confuse a shooter and triangulate his port. Others stuffed uniforms or sandbags to make full-body dummies. The spread was organic and emotional. Fear pushed Marines to try anything that could halt the invisible killing, and hope kept the technique alive once it worked. In a battle defined by fortified complexity, one of the clearest lessons was that, under extreme pressure, the simplest field solution can outperform doctrine because it can be understood, built, and used in the same hour it is born. By November 22nd, on Betio, the Japanese snipers and hidden riflemen were no longer hunting the way they had on the first 2 days. The defenders on Tarawa had come into the battle with a careful system, camouflage so complete that a shooter could disappear into palm crowns, narrow firing slits, or sand-covered spider holes, preselected lanes of fire, and the discipline to wait for a clean, certain kill before firing. U.S. battle histories and veteran accounts make clear how widespread these concealed positions were and how much of the early fighting was shaped by rifle fire coming from places the Marines could not immediately locate. The appearance of helmet. Decoys provides targets lifted above cover to trigger a shot change the risk calculation for every Japanese marksman who was still alive. A sniper's advantage is invisibility, but invisibility has a cost. The moment he fires, he creates a flash, a sound signature, and a line of trace that helps the enemy narrow his hide. On a small, crowded island where firing points were close to Marine positions, that moment of exposure could be fatal. Decoys were designed to force that moment again and again, and even when they failed to draw fire, they disrupted the sniper's rhythm by injecting uncertainty into what had been a predictable hunt. Japanese doctrine stressed patience, ammunition discipline, and shooting only when a target was worth revealing a position under normal conditions that maximize lethality. Under decoy conditions, it became a trap. If a sniper fired at a helmet that wasn't real, he risked immediate counterfire and the loss of a carefully prepared hide. If he held fire, he risked watching real Marines move and consolidate without interference. By the later stages of the fight, Japanese shooters were increasingly forced into this no-win choice. Contemporary accounts of Tarawa show that Japanese defenders adjusted their methods as U.S. units pressed inland, relying more on coordinated fires from strong points and less on isolated shots at every exposed figure, because the close assault and growing Marine foothold were eroding the old system. That adjustment, however, carried its own penalty. The battlefield no longer rewarded their original specialty. Snipers who waited only for obvious groups or unmistakably real targets passed up shots they would have taken earlier. And the more they hesitated, the more freedom Marines gained to reposition, bring up support weapons, and reduce firing pits one by one. Doubt spread through a force that had depended on certainty. A shooter who isn't sure what he's looking. It is a shooter who loses initiative, and on Tarawa, losing initiative meant being overrun, burned out, or buried in a collapsed spider hole dot, so the decoys did more than waste rounds. They poisoned confidence. They turned an elite skill-selective patience into paralysis, and they forced Japanese snipers into revealing themselves or surrendering the battlefield to men who were learning, minute by minute, how to make the island's shadows betray the rifles inside them. By the third day of fighting on Betio, Marines were no longer using helmet decoys as a one-off trick. In several sectors, the technique had become systematic enough that squads began expanding it. The battlefield encouraged that kind of escalation. Tarawa was tiny, just over 100 hectares, but it was saturated with interlocking trenches and concrete strongpoints. So, a single hidden rifleman could stall movement across an entire lane. The Japanese garrison had prepared those positions for months, and many of the most dangerous shooters were tied to reinforced bunkers with multiple firing slits, designed to survive bombardment and keep firing even when the beachhead tightened. Around them in that setting, some Marine squads began raising not one decoy, but several at once from different angles. The logic was battlefield clean. A sniper might ignore a single helmet if he suspected a trick, or he might fire and shift before Marines could lock down the exact slot. But if multiple heads appeared simultaneously around a strong point, the shooter had to choose. And the moment he chose, he exposed which slit, which tree crown, or which trench mouth he was actually using. The decoys compressed the sniper's decision window. They forced him to reveal himself on a timetable controlled by the attackers. Veteran recollections and later retellings of the Tarawa fight describe a dramatic version of this idea of focus. On a stubborn bunker sniper who had pinned Marines for days. The key details vary by account and are not singled out in official battle narratives. But the tactical sequence is consistent with what Marines were doing elsewhere on the island. A squad positions several improvised decoys, raises them together, watches for the flash, then smothers the chosen firing port with overwhelming fire and close assault explosives. On Tarawa, those close assault methods were standard practice. Engineer and flamethrower teams were repeatedly used to neutralize pillboxes and covered pits that rifles alone could not silence. And satchel charges were a common solution once a firing slit was identified. So the 6 helmets moment matters. Less for the specific name attached to it than for what it represents in the battle's turning point. The decoy idea had matured from bait into a trap. A reinforced bunker that once operated like a blind machine firing from one slit, shifting, to another daring Marines to guess, could now be compelled to speak. The first shot at a decoy marked the port. The second Marine in the pair confirmed it. And the response was immediate. Bar burst to pin the aperture. Rifle fire to deny movement between slits, then a flamethrower jet or a satchel charge to finish. The position inside its own concrete shell dot at that stage of Tarawa, this was the closest thing the battle had to a solution moment. The island had been designed to erase Marine counter-sniper doctrine by hiding shooters faster than they could be found. Multi-decoy traps flipped the equation. Even the most entrenched marksmen could be forced into a single choice, and that choice led straight to silence. Within hours, what had been an invisible killing field began to feel mapped and solvable, because a simple helmet on a stick had become a system that could break the deadliest strongpoint on the island. When the fighting on Betio finally ended on November 23, 1943, the Battle of Tarawa was recorded as one of the Marine Corps' costliest amphibious assaults of the war. A 76-hour struggle that forced the Corps to rethink everything from landing doctrine to small unit survival on atolls. Official Marine histories emphasize how quickly Marines had to adapt on the island, because pre-war manuals could not fully account for the density of Japanese fortifications and the brutal, close ranges of the fight inside that larger story of adaptation. Helmet decoys became part of the quiet toolbox Marines carried forward. The after-action culture of Tarawa was to capture lessons, not to celebrate a single inventor. And that is why the decoy method entered Marine memory as a field innovation rather than a name breakthrough. Later retellings and channel reconstructions identify Private First Class Marcus Holland as the Marine who first demonstrated the idea under fire. But even these sources note that official documentation did not single him out at the time. In other words, Holland's role survives mainly through veteran recollections and later historians, not through a wartime commendation trail. Holland himself was wounded soon after the technique spread and was evacuated from the island. A common fate on Tarawa where units were being cut down and shuffled by necessity. The trick he helped popularize, however, did not disappear with him. Marines carried the principle into later Pacific campaigns where Japanese snipers and concealed rifle pits remained a deadly constant. Over time, the decoys evolved from spare helmets on sticks into more elaborate dummy targets, sometimes full mannequins because the underlying logic worked. Make the enemy commit his shot to something false. Then kill him in the brief moment he reveals his position. Secondary accounts trace this pattern across battles, such as Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where Marines again faced deeply hidden shooters and relied on improvisation alongside doctrine. After the war, the Marine Corps systematically studied Pacific combat experience to refine training for future infantry units. Tarawa, as a proving ground of both failure and innovation, fed directly into that process. The Corps incorporated decoy concepts into broader counter-sniper instruction not because of one dramatic anecdote, but because battlefield evidence kept pointing to the same conclusion. In close terrain against hidden marksmen, deception could save lives faster than brute suppressive fire alone. The injustice is that the doctrine survived while the origin story faded. Holland returned home after the war, lived quietly, and died without public recognition for what later historians argue was a life-saving contribution. That gap between impact and memory is not unusual in war. Most battlefield innovations are. Born low to the ground in foxholes, behind seawalls, in moments when someone notices a pattern and refuses to keep paying the old price. Their names are often lost because wars record outcomes more reliably than they record the small human. Sparks that shape them, and that is the modern echo of Tarawa's helmet decoys. History doesn't only move through generals and grand plans. Sometimes it turns on a spare helmet, a bayonet, and a private who applied a farm lesson to a lethal problem. If you want more stories like this real, documented, and rescued from, the margins stay with the channel. These are the people and moments that explain how wars are actually survived.